All right, so we're going to start the event. So thank you everyone for coming this evening. The event we're all here for is a conversation on a publication by the historian and writer Robin Evans. And the book we're going to be talking about, which of course will delve into lots of different areas of his work, is translations from drawing to building and other essays. My name is Ryan Dillon. I'm the head of communications at the AA, so we oversee the publications at the school. And so I want to just thank everyone for the effort of the reprint. I also would like to thank Bonnie Evans, who is here joining us, and thank her family and all the support they gave us for the reprint of the book and their excitement about that. And also working with Bonnie, and thank you for helping organize the event this evening. With that, I'm going to pass over to the panel soon, but the book itself and Robin's work has been extremely influential to the AA, where Robin was a student and graduated in 1970. The book itself is a collection of writings that he did between 1970 and 1990. So from his graduation onwards. And we're very excited to reprint it as a publication because it's a book that's on so many of our reading lists, bibliographies for courses from units, from design units to history and theory, across undergraduate to postgraduate programs. Robin was an incredible thinker, writer, and historian who really sort of changed how we think about and approach critical writing within the architectural discipline. First and foremost, one of the things I think about is how he didn't look at screens in front of him, he looked at the actual objects, whether that was buildings or drawings or models, to begin to critically analyze and deconstruct architectural projects that seem so familiar to us, from Eisenman exhibitions to Barcelona Pavilion. He had an ability to make what looked familiar seem so unfamiliar to us through a deconstruction of the project itself, through critical analysis and observation. He would take things like the Barcelona Pavilion and look at the images that we saw in books and represent them to us through their reconstruction through his writing. He would then, through that reconstruction, produce a new image of things that looked familiar and gave us a new reading in how we observe sort of architectural objects. It's something extremely important for us to consider in how every time we look at a building, no matter how familiar or a drawing, we can reproduce that through the form of writing. His writing is digestible, understandable, tying together and linking together amazing areas of philosophy, architecture, painting, drawing, film, etc. And so with that, we tried to reprint the book and republish it to disseminate to the current generation of practitioners, students, architects, in the same kind of idea and hopefully legible way of writing. It's the same exact content in a new form. So with that, I'm going to pass over to Rory Sherlock, who will chair the event this evening, and we'll get to it. After that, there will be drinks to continue the conversation, and a small plug for the publications department. You can also purchase the book in the back at the end of the event. So thank you, and look forward to the conversation.
Yeah, thanks very much. I guess the way I'm going to just kind of briefly introduce Bob Evans, I guess as he preferred to be known, to those who might not necessarily have much of an understanding of him and his influence, before making an introduction to each of our panel, and then we'll kind of take the conversation from there. So really we're here tonight, I suppose, to have a conversation about Robin Evans, who was a remarkable historian, theorist, and teacher of architecture, who has had a significant and lasting impact not only on the people that he taught, but also on the architectural discipline more broadly. Through his highly influential publications, including The Projective Cast and Translations from Drawing to Building, which I suppose is the reason we're here tonight. His essays and his teaching, Evans has influenced the lives of many, either indirectly or directly, and many of whom will be in this room, whether they kind of know it or not. He was renowned for his lucidity, originality, clarity of thought and expression, as well as his enthusiasm, lack of cynicism, and humor, all of which are exceptionally valuable and humane traits of an educator and theorist of architecture, and I think ones to which we, certainly all of us teachers, can aspire. And as both a student and a teacher at the AA, he sort of maintained a character as somebody who went their own way, who stayed slightly apart from the crowd in order to more readily make more intelligent and often far-reaching assessments than those of his colleagues. He was utterly sensitive towards his own background and the changing context of education in the education in the UK throughout his career, and brought into his teaching a desire to break boundaries, not just economically and socially, but also philosophically and ultimately architecturally. So the arc of this session, really, and I think the conversation that I'll help to facilitate, is really just to understand the changing context of education and the extraordinary relevance of Evans's ideas throughout those sequences of changes. So in essence, really, one of the reasons why I'm a tutor here, and I teach elsewhere as well, and for me as a teacher, I think he's incredibly important in a way because he prefigured a sort of understanding and an approach towards complexity in architecture and an attempt to synthesize it in the discipline in the way that it's taught and also practiced. This is intensely relevant today, at least I think so. We'll see what the rest of the panel think, as architects can no longer afford to be or justify the pursuit of form alone necessarily, in a sort of phenomenological sense. And during his career, though, this was something, certainly while he was a student at the AA and through reading the school reports that were prepared every year as he finished, this was an imbalance to be corrected. This sort of desire to synthesize was always seen actually as something that he was resisting. So here we are tonight to interrogate these ideas, to interrogate his formation as a designer and the changing context of architectural learning that he sat within, with reference to, I think, this kind of wonderful book that's been so influential for many of us. Essentially, Robin really was a man who changed his ideas and focus in response to the changing conditions of, well, institutional and societal conditions around him, and who always maintained a detachment from trends throughout his career. This was, in essence, to identify patterns that nobody else had noticed, to view things from outside rather than from within, in order to perpetually keep himself, his colleagues, his students, and the wider architectural world on its toes. Throughout his career, he encountered massive change, not only in global and local society, but also in the way the discipline was evolving at speed within the UK and without. So he entered university here in a moment when the welfare state was in decline, I guess, after the war. He encountered the AA at the time, which was an exclusive in a sort of upper-class English pragmatic way, and full of people from public schools and connected families. But then he moved very quickly afterwards, at a moment also when the AA was about to fold, to Essex to study under Joseph Requet at one of the plate glass universities, that the whole premise of which really was to expand access to education. After this period, when he returned to the AA, Thatcherism in the 1980s and also her role as the Minister of Education in the early 70s had completely catalyzed kind of major changes to architecture, to education, to also the AA as an institution and many other institutions beyond. And this sort of came through a series of policies, like Right to Buy. We're talking about the sort of replacement of the University Grants Committee, which was so essential to his formative education. And he became one of the first unit masters at the AA under the system established by Alvin Boyarsky, who in many ways was a sort of free marketeer, potentially at odds with many of his own kind of sensibilities, which I think would be interesting also to discuss more about. He then left the AA completely in the mid-80s and joined what was then the Polytechnic of Central London, now the University of Westminster, before venturing abroad to Harvard and many other institutions in Northern America to continue challenging his ideas and perpetually seeking new environments, I think, in which to expose and develop his theories. So we'll sort of look, therefore, this evening, I guess, at the evolution of his career in endlessly changing circumstances, which should, I hope, act as a perfect foil for talking about the book, about translations from drawing to building, which I think in an incredibly elegant way charts just his journey and the evolution of a unique voice in architecture and theory. So on the panel this evening, we have Richard Difford, second to my right, who's Principal Lecturer in Architecture and Cities at the University of Westminster. As I said before, formerly the PCL, which we'll talk much about. Richard was a former student of Bob's at PCL and is now an academic and a tutor. So in addition to his research and publications, Richard's teaching also focuses on architectural representation, the history of science and mathematics, and the use of electronics in coding and design. We also have at the end of the table is Ben Stringer, who's a senior lecturer at University of Westminster as well and a studio tutor, also a former student of Bob's. And currently, in addition to his own research and developing a PhD by practice, he runs a design studio with Peter Barber. Correct?
That's right, yeah.
We have immediately to my right Carlos Villanueva Brandt, another former student of Evans's from his time teaching at the AA, who is now a long-time teacher of Diploma 10. Many of you in the room will know him. And he continues, I suppose, the long and rich legacy of Dip 10, from which he emerged, I suppose, under Nigel Coates and also one of the founding members of NATO. And then finally, we have Emily Priest, who is an architect and a teacher as well. She teaches in first year at Bartlett. Emily studied here at the AA, and her fifth-year thesis was, I guess, concerned specifically also with the writings of Robin Evans, and went on to win the Dennis Sharp Award with that essay. She's now a member of the print studio here, working with Ryan, and also therefore is a kind of representative of the school with respect to the publication of the book itself. Hopefully that's not too verbose an introduction to everybody and everything that we're going to be talking about, but I think really to sort of start the discussion, in a way, I think it'd be interesting to sort of proceed along the lines of the shifts that have taken place in Robin Evans as a sort of character and as a theorist, starting really with his education here at the AA in the mid-60s. So he arrived in 1963. I don't know if, Carlos, you might want to sort of start by giving some characterization of what the school might have been like at that time.
Well, I mean, I can't go back to time when I wasn't here. So I think I came across Bob in 81. So I brought projects review, the projects that I did with him. I must have been quite confident. There's a lot of my drawings in here. But I could give you a picture of what the school was like then. And I think this image on the cover sums it up. So in a sense, it was the beginning of postmodernism. There was a very sort of facile conversation about style and so on. That's what was out there in terms of the conversations. And the school didn't address that, and Bob certainly didn't address that. He looked at the same issues that were being looked outside, but in a sort of forensic way. So I think it's a very interesting way to see it. I think he had colleagues at the time. So in a sense, Dalibor was doing something similar, but he didn't have the kind of forensic qualities that Bob had. So he looked at history in a slightly different way. And the other one was Fred Scott, who he taught with before I went into his unit. So there was a sort of conversation taking place. I think what stood Bob's unit out really was that he didn't play the style game at all. And that's what the conversation was. So there's a conference here like this one day at the time, which is called Question of Style. And you were either a modernist or you were a postmodernist. In a sense, we got the Charles Jenks chart out there. That Charles Jenks was also here at the time. So I think within the context of the school, there was historicism. Both the Creer brothers had been teaching here beforehand. So Bob was sharing time with them. And what really stood him out was that he never allowed himself to be kind of sort of pigeonholed historically. So he could talk about the 18th century, or he could talk about London without necessarily having to say, I belong to this camp or belong to the other camp. Mm-hmm. So I think that was the first demonstration within the debates of the school. Obviously, there were very important people in the school, like Charles Jenks, like Peter Cook, and so on. Basically, Bob was his own man, and I think that's what made it quite special. I think actually in the 80-81, that was the case in the school. The school was quite small.
Was it also quite divided, do you think, actually, with those camps quite entrenched?
It was kind of, we didn't have the debates that were going outside. I think possibly in the Bartlett there was more of a conversation of, kind of sort of, are you a historicist or not? And certainly in America. So, kind of some people adored Michael Graves' drawings and some people didn't, in a sense. I think what was interesting is I think there was a more generous debate. And I think Bob was very open-minded. He wasn't someone who criticized other people, actually, and I think as is demonstrated in the book, he makes a tremendous effort to talk about Eisenman. He doesn't just say I don't like it. He writes a lot of words to get there, and I think that was one of his contributions in that sense. I think in terms of actually the experience of Bob, I think it's interesting in today's. You mentioned. The fact that the AA was quite a Thatcherite model, it still is actually, of kind of sort of. Bob wasn't popular. He wasn't, Peter Cook, all these people were beginning to be stars, Bernard Toomey, all these people were sort of. Bob wasn't interested in that.
Do you think that was because he sort of resisted being in any one camp or another? He wasn't.
I think as a person, I think Bob was utterly humble. I don't think he wanted to be known as, the great historian or the great something else. And that was one of the things that made him stand out. But also, I think, is one of the things why his teaching was so influential, because he was very generous with his knowledge. And you asked me earlier, I think a lot of the book, which was written after I was a student, I think almost all the essays I was aware of. Just talking to him, he was already discussing those ideas. So I think he was very kind of open in those days in that sense. I think he was great at the AA. He also was an architect, actually, which no one talks about. So he did these incredible projects in Africa and stuff, which were pretty amazing. So
yeah, that's right. He worked in Nairobi for the Department
exactly.
of Planning.
So in those days, he still talked about those. After that, he became more a theoretical person. But it was very interesting. In that
it really
sense.
seems that his days at the AA as well. I obviously come at it from studying books in a way and reading about what was happening at the time. But it seems really as though it was a moment of immense kind of flux within the institution itself. But actually what Robin was doing in his teaching, particularly with Fred, and I think also immediately afterwards when you will have been in the unit, was sort of striving towards a synthesis on the one hand of a perhaps historicist or a approach towards an understanding of form and of the built object, but also attaching that and connecting it to much more, I suppose, relevant at that time, also social theory, sociology, anthropology. He was kind of starting really to make quite deep connections, I think, between the structures and systems of society and how they were inextricably interwoven with the built object, that somehow they weren't separable in any sort of material sense. And that's something that is evident in his work as a student as well, at a time when the AA seems to have had very little interest in that sort of synthesis. In fact, he mainly gets accused of being too abstract in his kind of end-of-year reports. But I think it's always striving to kind of associate social value and formalism in some way, and to not get too distracted necessarily by phenomenology, which I think he was wary of necessarily with Dalibor particularly. But sorry.
I think one comment on that simply is that we'll talk about legacy later, but when the book was published and I read Mohsen Mustafa's introduction, I never realized, I've dedicated my whole life to what I call a relationship between physical structures and social structures. And when I read that, I realized that it started with Bob, it didn't start at Dip 10. So when you read that introduction, Bob was always completely obsessed in how life was part of what architecture might be in different ways, in different periods. And obviously at the urban scale, rookeries and so on, So the year that I studied with Bob, he was with John Andrews. They were two Londoners.
Andrew was a former student of Bob's as well, right?
I'm not sure if he was, actually. I don't know. Maybe he was. But that was also part of it, which was to do with that knowledge of the city as well. So it's something that doesn't get discussed about Bob very much, but he took us everywhere. He showed us everything. He showed us the model. It was amazing. So we were a bit like school children. We kind of sort of followed him along like the Pied Piper, and he was full of knowledge. And it was just simply going around London. And I was saying to his daughter, we were invited to his house, which is quite unusual for a tutor. But it was, great. So he was very generous in terms of the conversations about the social situations in cities, which is not necessarily the way he wrote about it. I really enjoy the fact that he puts it into an architectural context. But actually, he was completely focused on the sort of social dimension of what architecture might do, which it took me a long time to realize that maybe that's where it all started for me, was by osmosis with Bob rather than by what I did later at Diploma 10.
But I wonder, I guess there's a kind of legacy there also that connects your teaching now also to Bob's teaching then, and his also to Joseph's before him, in a way. I think that his sort of, as a student of his, were you aware in a way of what he was doing in a way, or what he had done in his PhD with Joseph, which was a book that later became a book studying prisons, that actually was 6 years prior to Foucault writing Discipline and Punish. Robin kind of prefigured the interest in the sort of structures of architecture also as being that which influences or controls behavior. And somehow that's what's borne out in his teaching here when he first comes and teaches the diploma unit, that really it was about understanding that architecture at that time also, which I think was novel for the moment, and now I think we think of much, or too flippantly perhaps, is that architecture as a structure of control, as an instrument for the manipulation of society and behavior as much as the other way around. And it kind of, that prefigured, I suppose, a lot of conversations too about the agency of the architect, and much of what we probably teach today. Was that kind of also part of the teaching as you experienced it? Was it?
It's interesting. I think Bob is unique actually in the way he did things, and I think one of the interesting things was that he would give you the knowledge, and unlike the current situation where people tell you what their PhD was and what their sources were, he didn't. He took you to see where the rookeries were, he took you to Seven Dials, he took you to the first, and he just told you what it was and why it was done. So something like the walls in the article, we were shown that. We were told when the first bedroom appeared, He didn't say what my sources are. In the writing they're there, but I think when he was teaching, he would actually just give you the information or point you in a particular direction. And I think that's very refreshing about when you read his writing. I mean, you mentioned it. First of all, it's in plain English, which is fantastic. It's brilliant. And I think that's where he taught. I don't think he ever sort of emanated his huge knowledge that he had. In a sense, he gave you knowledge and then shared it with you. He didn't sort of go. So I wasn't aware of his PhD or the things he introduced me to people. But he didn't sort of say this person is important or this is a reference or I'm looking at that. He was very much, it was a privilege actually to be with him because he was very genuine in what he said. So he gave you information without the root. So I didn't even know he'd done a postgraduate degree.
It also feels as well with the writing, I guess, that he's really using that as a medium to, deconstruct drawings or work out what's happening in drawings or work out what's happening in life versus drawings. And I think it's really nice to also kind of comment on the way the essays are written and the kind of closeness the writing seems to have to the objects. It's really not stuffy, it's kind of very straightforward and honest about. And it's interesting about the artifacts as well, if there was kind of no hierarchy between the sites and drawings, and you can really see that in the essays.
Yes, Bob was my dissertation tutor at PCL, so I had the sort of direct experience of him being guided by him to produce a piece of writing. And I think what Carlos said is absolutely right. He would never directly force a particular position on you. Rather, it would be about pointing you in the right direction. I remember very distinctly being told to go and read something. You go and read it, and then suddenly you realise how stupid you'd been when you read what he told you to read. So rather than pointing out your mistakes, he allowed you to find them for yourself.
That also seems reasonably rare at the time, to have someone sort of teach with the carrot, not the stick, in a sort of quite non-professorial way, to sort of create an environment within which you can find the answers for yourself and sort of make associations just as a sort of through a field of different kind of references and allusions and knowledge, kind of pieces of interconnected knowledge. I think that seems quite special for the time.
But also now I feel students are increasingly less comfortable with being put in a position where they need to kind of go and look at something or figure something out for themselves, or kind of knowing that there's not really necessarily a wrong answer, or at least this is what my students who are first years feel like. They want to kind of know the answer before they do the workings out. And I think also what Carlos was saying about writing words to get there is a really nice way of, thinking about writing, but also kind of going to visit a site is as much as a kind of working towards something and moving towards something. So it's...
One comment on that, actually. I think if certainly the year that he when he was teaching in diploma school, I think he didn't use theory as a structural thing. I think he used London as a palimpsest. So I learned almost everything about London with Bob. So we traced the Fleet River. I did a project in Mount Pleasant. He told me what Mount Pleasant was, all the bodies from the plague. So he did use London as a tool to teach us things. I went to see the first model flat in Kennington Park. He'd take us along. And so I think that was one way that he structured things rather than his theoretical point of view. I think he took you to places, he showed you things. He actually took us quite a lot outside London to see country houses and so on, and then we discussed some of the ideas which are in the book. And I think that was very refreshing at the time because, we weren't quite in crocodile like school children, but it was the adventure of going to see something, and then he'd just talk. And then, like you say, you were capable of interpreting or reacting or not, and then that was that. But actually, it was incredibly instructive and so on. So very different to the way academic structures now kind of say, okay, this is my thesis, this is what I do, this is what I'm going to talk about. I think I feel a debt to him in terms of really using London as something there, and I've dedicated my whole life to working in London, so it's quite interesting way that he had that sort of quality.
Out of interest, did he ever encourage you to write in your kind of design process in the studio?
Well, no, the school was very different actually. The interesting thing was there was a huge gamut. You didn't have to stick to one thing. So when I was with Bob, actually, I wrote about the Redentore in Venice. And I actually did my technical studies with Bob. You could choose these things in those years. So he didn't sort of necessarily encourage you to use text in a sense. In fact, actually, drawing. The school was obsessed with drawing. Everything was shaded drawings, whether it was Dalibor, him, almost all the units. It's black and white stuff. It's all pencil shaded, the whole lot. And I think that was the technique at the time. So he did encourage that. We worked incredibly hard, but on drawing more than on text.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was just kind of thinking I think it was a really good point about the lucidity of the text somehow, and also how it becomes a tool. That actually, in a way, that while he was a student here, that was leveled at him as a critique regularly, that the text was somehow unimportant. And actually, as a tool for the designer, he was critiqued in a way for being too verbose and for talking better than he could design. And it's kind of amazing how that has changed also, I suppose. I know from direct experience, I would kind of always encourage students to write in parallel with design. I don't know also if it's something that you actively do, but he is incredibly sort of preternaturally gifted writer and communicator, I think.
But he does write like a designer, doesn't he? I mean, that's one of the things about. That's one of the things that makes him so accessible to an architecture student is that you can sort of feel how he's kind of thinking spatially as well as about images and the history, and he thinks very laterally. He's pulling all these different strands together. So I really felt as a student that he really understood kind of me in a way, you know, as a designer. As an undergraduate, apart from Bob and one or two others, but architectural history was taught in quite a dry way. I mean, especially before modernism, it really was about, you know, telling the difference between a Corinthian and an Ionic column or something, you know, and it was frustrating, and I remember complaining about it, and somebody said, well, we'll read Bob's Figures, Doors and Passages, and that really, really resonated with me, and it made me realise that there were people out there doing, as you say, connecting the social with the style, you know, so that there were kind of social events happening at the same time as these designs were being drawn.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it's also interesting that to sort of follow on from that, and as you were saying, Carlos, there's this kind of period of time also at the AA in the early 80s when he is still teaching the design unit, and I think still trying to sort of make those ideas resonate. And clearly it did with you and your colleagues, and clearly his influence was pretty significant, I think. But also it's something that he seems to have grown quite tired with, that the kind of obsession with drawings is actually something he seems to sort of rankle with him, at least in his writing. And there's a text that was in the first edition of AA Files, I believe, or it was one of the final editions of AAQ as it kind of made the transition, where he sort of laments in a way the changing nature of the AA and its absolute obsession with drawings and forms of representation at the expense potentially of those sort of broader social concerns that he was really meaningfully trying to connect, I suppose, in the work of his unit and the research that his students were conducting. So at that moment, in a way, he makes a break with the AA. He went off to teach in Vermont for a year, having been also kind of made an offer, and then returns and starts teaching at the Polytechnic of Central London at PCL. So I guess it's interesting to understand how maybe his role shifted also, and because at first that was a part-time role that sort of evolved into a lecturing position, but he was teaching design in those early days as well as history and theory, right?
Yeah, well, I had him as a design tutor more than as a dissertation tutor, so yeah.
I think you're right though that the work he later does on drawing does emerge out of a sort of, a frustration at the role of drawings in architecture, and particularly architectural education, and shifting the focus to drawing as a tool rather than simply as a way to seduce.
Sure. Is this an appropriate moment perhaps for you to
possibly
show your slides? Yeah, we have some.
My particular interest is in the essay from which the collection of essays gets its name, from Drawing to Building. Beginning with the article Translations from Drawing to Building, originally published in 1986, which is incidentally the year that I started Polytechnic of Central London as an undergraduate student in first year. Robin Evans' research would concentrate in one way or another on the special significance that drawing has for architecture. Over the next few years, this work would lead him through many fascinating avenues of inquiry, culminating in the book The Projective Cast. But it was not only what Robin Evans had to say about drawings that was important, it was how he used them. Indeed, his own drawings feature in almost all of his publications. They illustrate, explain, and illuminate his writing. And with the same ease as with his writing, The often complex and challenging ideas that he explored were conveyed with absolute clarity through drawings and diagrams. But as with architectural drawing more generally, his own drawings were not simply, as he put it, trucks for pushing ideas from place to place. They were investigative tools. These drawings clearly functioned as part of his own thinking process, a way of testing and exploring possibilities in ideas, much, in fact, as they're used in design. But they were also, I suggest, his way of bridging the intervening centuries to disclose meaning not only lost to the modern viewer, but sometimes actively obscured by previous art historical interpretation. The closest analogy I can think of is the practice of experimental archaeology, in which researchers reconstruct artifacts and techniques of the past in order to better understand the culture in which they were originally produced. Drawing, in this case, provides a link between objective technical understanding and historical interpretation. His analytical drawings also demonstrate how much can be gained by actually doing something as opposed to just reading about it. Our modern sensibilities ensure that we can never, of course, experience what it was like for, say, Fulbert Delorme to have actually made a drawing such as this trait. But by engaging with drawing as a process, we can at least overcome the tendency to understand them merely as something to be looked at. And by understanding and reproducing the technique, we can perhaps also gain some insight into how the original author of the drawing saw the world. Nowhere is the power of drawing as research better exemplified than in Evans's analysis of the Royal Chapel at Annay in Translations from Drawing to Building. Delorme himself had intimated that there was some kind of projective relationship between the pattern of ribs in the dome and the floor tiling below. And this apparent correspondence had led generations of interpreters to casually assume that the floor had to be a direct map of the dome. Remarkably, no one, it seems, had bothered to investigate further, despite the fact that the number of intersections in the floor and the dome did not match. Evans's analysis through drawing not only revealed the assumed correspondence to be incorrect, it also drew out, quite literally, a more complex and subtle relationship, one which did more to exploit the generative potential of parallel projection than simply creating a tile pattern from the plan of the dome. Significantly, the plan is the generator, and it's in the interaction between a pattern of circles drawn in plan and the notional hemisphere of the dome that the elegant vortex of tracery is created. But it took Evans's inquiring mind and his analytical drawings to reveal this. This, of course, is just one of the many insightful moments contained in these essays. As a student, I was lucky enough to be taught by Robin Evans, and that, of course, was now quite a long time ago. But I think it's fair to say that these essays have enduring value. The republication will, I think, help to ensure that Evans's work continues to be discovered and read by new generations of architects and architecture students.
Thanks very much. I think that's a really kind of helpful kind of introduction also then to the later phase of his writing and career and teaching also, where he sort of, I suppose ironically enough, also having come from the AA with a fairly scathing critique in a way of its obsession with drawings, he then perhaps, I think, also given a different academic context, also in a state university, away perhaps from some broader concerns, perhaps with the overall arc of the AA and the line that it was starting to trace, he really turns his attention squarely towards the drawing. That he really, maybe in that change of context, also in response changes his ideas to look really at how the drawing perhaps has been overlooked, or how, at least within the AA context, it was being looked at in a sort of hollow way, and he really wanted to kind of instrumentalize it in his teaching at PCL, perhaps.
Absolutely. I think it's about thinking about the drawing as a tool, and as such, I mean, Ben mentioned earlier the fact that he was writing as an architect, and I think the research that he did through drawing was a way of exploiting the skills that architects have, but turning them to the subject of art history or architectural history. And I think that it is perhaps a way of addressing a kind of blindness that architectural historians have perhaps had to the processes by which things come into being, and where they concentrate on the outcome rather than actually understanding how that thing came about. And by being able to draw and using drawing as a tool, he reveals things that art historians completely missed.
I mean, a comment on that. I mean, I think I'm speculating here, but Bob was surrounded by competition. Yeah, so I mean, when he was here, Dalibor was here, Rodriguez Perdas, the Creers had been teaching here before, Summerson was teaching here, Francis Yates was teaching here, memory diagrams and so on. Charles Jenks obviously was writing about postmodernism. So I think Bob made an effort to differentiate himself actually to a certain degree within that context. So, Summerson never did drawings to understand history. He writes extremely well, and he looks at, and I think I feel that Bob used his skills as an architect to be a historian, and I think he might have done that on purpose. I think Dalibor never, he sketched and so on, but it never got past actually the late 19th century. But it was always a historical tradition in a sense, and I think he might have done the drawings and the sort of forensic work that he did in a sense to differentiate from quite a crowd. I mean, these are all unbelievable people, and they were all, I mean, when he was teaching here, they were all here. So he didn't want to do a Charles Jenks. He didn't want to do diagrams that are called isms. That wasn't his style. And I think he had very, very close relationship with Summerson and so on, etc. And I think some of the adaptations of drawings and that kind of personal sort of forensic way of looking at architecture, I think might have been something he wanted to do, but also it distinguished him from all the other historians that were talking at the time. And I think that then might have exploded into something which he took a lot further, in a sense, in terms of... So I think all these things that began to work in that way are really very interesting, and I think it made him very different to everybody else. I think also, in terms of the institutions, it's quite interesting. I think maybe it was the way I felt. He struggled in the institutions, I think, a little bit, because I mean, he played with Cambridge for a long time, and Bob.
Well, he taught with Moyson.
Well, yes, and Dalibor, obviously there was a sort of thing happening there and so on, and but as a description, I mean, Bob was the man with the plastic bag with the brilliant books in it. I mean, he sort of, he was completely, and so I think people couldn't quite read it. Cambridge didn't know whether to give him full rein or not give him full rein. So he introduced me to Peter Carl, for instance, who then became professor at Cambridge. And I'm not saying he was gauche there, but I think he found it hard to find his milieu. I think he was a different person, and I think institutions maybe found it a little bit awkward to deal with. A, the way he thought, B, his drawings, and C, the fact that they couldn't pigeonhole him into a thing.
I was going to say, I'm sure that there's
it's a terrific thing, but it's very interesting, actually. I think he had a battle on his hands, because a lot of these people that I'm saying were discussing similar issues, but in a very different way, and with a certain kind of... I mean, the Creers were very prescriptive. They knew what the city was like. It was a bit like Aldo Rossi and so on. He wasn't into that. So maybe the things he wasn't into made him struggle a little bit harder with the institutions, whether it was the AA, Cambridge, or I don't know, the experience in Westminster. But he was a bit of an outsider, I think, in a sense, in terms of after he passed away, I think everybody realised, oh my God, we should have nurtured this a little bit better, kind of thing. I mean, it's a sort of, I think it's an interesting sort of...
yeah, I don't know if you guys will have the same thought, both from reading his texts and also from having been taught by him directly and studying him, that it's incredibly complex, actually, what he kind of argues for throughout his career. Yeah, that ability not necessarily to be pinned down and to endlessly kind of respond to the conditions that he finds himself in, I think is quite rare and special, but also gives him a kind of volatility that one imagines that institutions don't like, or didn't, certainly. That, like you say, there wasn't necessarily a school associated with him, or that he would actually have sort of feet in many different ones. I think that he was, and what seems to me, and it's always been something quite influential in his writing, that he's deeply interested in form and formalism, but not as a structure of rhythms and sort of systems of composition necessarily. That actually, that's where he sort of probably departs from the more historicist tradition, and certainly from the Kriers. And I think also then seems not to be so interested in the poetry of it either, which perhaps distinguishes him from sort of Dalibor and Peter Karl and I guess others in that particular kind of vein of thought. And so he seems also in the drawings, and actually when he turns his attention back to drawing as a tool, like you say, it's still sort of clear in a way that he's always trying to connect it. He's never satisfied with the object itself, either as a representational form or as just the thing, the built thing. He's always trying to unpick it to a set of wider associations and implications.
Yes, to contextualize it. Yeah.
Sure.
I mean, I think it's true. Never subscribed to a position. Always looked at everything afresh and tried to understand it. And I think drawing provided a mechanism to do that. But also recognising that is also what was going on when these things were created in the first place. That these things are obviously contextualised in a particular time and culture and so on. But ultimately there was somebody there who was creating something, working through drawings, trying to work through a problem. And that's exactly what he does in the sort of reverse engineering of those things.
Yeah, I think for me, that whole kind of conversation is probably most apparent in the developed surface essay, which is also the kind of one I've looked at maybe the closest. And I guess feels like he's really struggling through that essay, or maybe enjoying this kind of progression of these internal elevations were kind of mirroring people's use of furniture, or how furniture was being designed and everything being against the wall. So that basically birthed this drawing that has all these kinds of particularities about it that he goes into. And then slowly, as furniture's being designed and uses change and furniture is coming away from the wall, this drawing kind of takes these different forms. And I think it's really nice also when he talks about the designers that are kind of struggling with this drawing, and you have these sort of floating bits of furniture that don't really quite work within the drawing that everyone's kind of agreed with. And then as soon as these bits of furniture find their own place in the kind of field of the interior, that drawing just becomes useless, and there's this kind of disposability of that drawing. And I think that's such a nice way of charting the drawing as a tool, something that came out of a kind of social and I guess design decision, and sort of took on this journey and then became useless. And I think often we'd kind of think of drawings as these really precious things, but actually something like that is seen as every line is there because it needs to be, rather than kind of which I guess goes back, well, shading is an interesting one also, but being really economical with how you're drawing and why you're drawing things, I mean, that will always be relevant. Yeah, and that essay I think is quite a funny story of those.
One anecdote on that one, actually, if I may. I mean, it's interesting because I think a lot of the ideas in the essays were nascent earlier on. Okay, so when I talk about these people that he might have been in competition, one of them he was very much in cahoots with, which is John Summerson. So I've got here as a student a developed surface drawing, and he took us to Soane's house, where Summerson was the director or whatever it was, and we were shown the Adam drawings. White gloves, the portfolio, was kind of shown to us. So Bob was already looking at those things at the time, so we were looking at the Adams interiors and so on. And I think these things just dated in time. I think he was absolutely fascinated by doing that. I think the connection was Summerson, who had his relationship with, and we were utterly privileged to be shown these drawings, which you can't get to see now unless you're a sort of researcher. So I think some of these ideas, particularly the developed surface, took their time to come along. He was sort of looking at actual drawings, how to represent and so on. And I think the essay is much later, where he condenses it into a kind of sort of a more of theoretical tract. But I think a lot of the things in the essay had a true gestation period. I think it wasn't overnight he came up with the idea, or I'm going to draw that. I think it was really very much, and I think he was quite collaborative in that way. He worked with other people to do his research, to try and understand things. So individual thinker, but in a sense a collaborator with other people to do his research.
I guess it's sort of that throughout his career he starts to sort of condense a lot of these ideas together, but express them in different, or articulate them in different ways. And that essay, like you say, I think was an amazing kind of desire in a way to understand that the drawing as a tool and a process, the act of composition and form, the systems and structures that underpin those things and eventually transform into a building are utterly sort of, they are inseparable. They're all part of one huge kind of mesh of what it means to be an architect or a spatial practitioner. And I think that starts to become more and more evident as he goes along. And actually, this fusion of kind of idea and I guess tool, in a way that they're not distinct, that one can't be viewed as an object, I think is very, very clear somehow, or seems clear also in his teaching. I wonder if this is a good moment also maybe to hand over to Ben with a few slides.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that for me, his essays were very often, for me, the starting point of a creative process. It wasn't just about learning about a particular era or drawing type. They actually inspired me, and I know lots of others, to mess around with drawings and to experiment with it. So I thought I might show a few examples of that I produced with Jane McAllister. So these are the sorts of drawings that Emily was talking about. This is one of the key drawings in the developed surface chapter by Robert Adam, who designed this space that we're in, I think. At the end of the essay, he sort of takes one slightly out of one's comfort zone, because he starts talking about plantations and things like this. So he goes from the living room, out into plantations and things. And so at one point we thought, well, let's try and do something similar. So we did a developed surface. So this is inside a shanty townhouse in a squatter settlement in Ahmedabad in India. We thought we would apply that sort of developed surface technique to that, but also we've got fascinated in the idea of the fold, the paper of the drawing, and how it might sort of open up in different and peculiar ways. And another aspect of that room is that the rooms that he talks about very often evoke some idea of travel. So they're quite often themed, like it might be a bit French or a bit Greek or a bit Roman, sometimes evoking something of the Grand Tour or something like that. So we messed around with that in a contemporary way, and we thought to mix up a Boeing 747 with a house. So there's a sort of that's the underbelly of a dismantled 747, and we ended up with Magaluf being turned into an object. So this is the sort of first photo survey of the beach at Magaluf, sort of wrapped around and turned into an object. So I just wanted to just make that point that for me the essays are a starting point for a creative process very often, as well as a sort of an academic kind of research or writerly way of thinking.
I think actually it's a great moment to bring it back to the essays themselves as well. I mean, we were talking a bit about this before, that, and Emily, you kind of alluded to it, that they're also their own sort of creative acts, and there are numerous moments in each essay throughout the text where he sort of does an about face, or he stops to sort of survey the territory, and he's very transparent about it, I think, in a way that's very engaging as a reader, that you feel like you're going along the process of uncovering something with him rather than being told or shown how to do it necessarily.
Yeah, I think even at the start of the developed surface, it starts with this article is not so much the written exposition of an argument as a development of some ideas by writing them down. Mm-hmm. So it does feel like this is, which I guess if it was also written formally across quite a long investigation. I mean, for me, you read this in an hour and it feels like this very synthesized development of events, but then actually it was probably multiple edits of notebooks and things like this, but yeah.
Yes, I mean, I think, as already mentioned, there's a long gestation period for a lot of this stuff, and I recall these as lectures before they were written. I think, and so yes, it's the kind of a process of investigation made into a piece of writing, ultimately.
Yeah, but it still feels very fresh. Like it's not, doesn't feel too smooth. It does feel like you're moving through decision making or things being solved. Like what were you saying?
It's interesting rereading that particular essay. It's kind of, it ends up on those mad drawings of the kind of furniture going in all directions and not knowing how to put them in and so on. And I think it's absolutely pertinent, but one of the things that occurred to me is that they should all be happening at once. We should have Adam, the furniture, the clusters in the middle of the room, the rookeries outside, that in a sense, if you put all Bob together into kind of what, it's a bit like some of those collages that you showed. And I think in that essay, he kind of sort of says, no, this one substituted the other. And my brain was going, no, I want them all at once. I want the sort of simultaneity of all these things happening at once. I want the stuff on the wall. I want the stuff in the middle of the room. I want the stuff on the outside. I want to meet the person in the gallery coming into that room where it's taking place. And I found that really exciting, that I was sort of not necessarily disagreeing with the conclusion, but I was actually seeing a bit what you were saying. I could be creative with what he was putting down in that essay, which I think is very, very exciting. And I think doing something with his essays maybe is what the students should be doing, not following them sort of biblically. But actually saying, what was he doing? Why would he do that? What would be even the drawing, you see? I mean, drawing. It's a big question. Is it you no longer sit doing? He drew those things and he went and measured them and so on. Do people still do that? It's the kind of.
Well, yeah. I mean, I was going to ask. Actually, I think it's an interesting question since we all are also teachers. This book, particularly, and I think Evans as both a figure and a theorist, his legacy is still very relevant and real. And I'm kind of interested to know how perhaps you each sort of use his theories in your own teaching, or how it's influenced maybe what you do. There are connections that are probably very clear and in terms of lineage and history, and there are probably some that are much more sort of ethereal. But it'd be interesting to hear from each of you about it.
Well, certainly from my point of view, it's quite explicit in that I've been running a dissertation group at the University of Westminster for over 20 years now, kind of based on the idea that you can use drawing as an investigative tool, and always encouraging students to use the skills that they have as a way of exploring ideas. But I think that the influences are kind of many and varied. That's very kind of a very specific and obvious one. But just the idea of thinking about things in an independent way and not simply following whatever kind of fashion of the moment or subscribing to a set of ideas.
But also very specifically, as you say, the issue of somehow, or the idea of forensis in drawing is something that's incredibly kind of relevant.
Yes, and something which has emerged as a separate discipline almost.
Yeah. Well, I did note that A.R. Weitzman did for forensic architecture with the Robin Evans lecturer a few years ago, and actually it's a very clear lineage, I think, in their work that seems like it expresses also in yours. I don't know about the rest of you.
I mean, I concur with all of them. So I said initially that most an essay, made me think, oh, Jesus Christ, I mean, this is where I picked this stuff up from. I think, the first two essays are very different, but I loved the first one towards architecture. The idea of resistance is something I work with all the way through. I think anecdote, maybe I learned from him. So, I mean, to suggest that it's 8:30 in the morning, but the bed sheets have done whatever, so it's easier to get out than it is on a normal morning when you've got the resistance of the bed. Amazing. I think that's the way we should be looking at things like resistance. I think the city's full of them. The retreat from the rights and so on is very much so, and I think people do that, and it's really problematic to not, to kind of blinker oneself. Obviously, figures, doors, and passages kind of affects everyone. So I think they're all there. So I was going through, and I was thinking, yeah, I do that. I try and continue that idea, and then I got to Mies. And, that one always stuck in my mind. I said, well, I've never done anything with this one. And then I remembered that in 1998, I did a competition for the Mies van der Rohe Foundation in Barcelona. And I created two asymmetrical landscapes in the square before you get to the pavilion. So there it was as well. So that one influenced actually a design project. It didn't influence my teaching, but all of a sudden I thought, I remember doing something. And it's completely based on his essay, but it's done on a landscape level of having a duality in the square and so on. So I think all of them have had a tremendous influence. And in my case, as I mentioned before, is this obsession between what I call physical structures and situations, and all of them work at that level. There's no time that he doesn't kind of, in a sense, introduce the usage or the cultural value of a place and so on into all the drawings that he does. The interesting thing is when he does the drawings, they do become quite abstract. And I can see that maybe you mentioned that some people thought he was a bit abstract at first. Actually, the diagrams in the first two essays are kind of weird. You know what I mean? He does his power things, you've got arrows and text going around like that. Some people might have said, well, you're trying to make diagrams of life. I can imagine that sort of reaction at the time. Mm-hmm. Afterwards, he becomes very inclusive and it's very kind of understandable what he's talking about.
Mm-hmm. How about you guys?
Well, I still recommend his essays to students, in different situations. But only yesterday, a student told me that another tutor had told her to read Rookeries and Model Dwellings, which I still think is a really good introduction to a sort of a social history of London's housing. Quite frequently, actually, I'm recommending essays from this book. Mm.
It's interesting. Also, over the summer, we're working in Hackney, so I'm always working in London. But I reread Ackroyd's Anthology of London, and it's just incredible how much of it is in here. And I read Summerson's Georgian London, and it's incredible how much of it is in here too. So they're also incredible condensers for different points of view. So Ackroyd, you've got to read your 850 pages of, and it's brilliant. But somehow, the Rookeries and the Model Dwelling do it so elegantly, in such a short. Again, it comes to the writing. This whole idea is that I think Ackroyd probably uses 50 pages to say the same thing, which is great. He's much more historical and so on. But it's incredible how this covers the whole history of the city of London and so on, and the things that he's looking at.
It's amazing kind of talent also for synthesis. Yeah. And I think one of the things I noticed sort of in preparing for the event was I also went through all of the program briefs and the extended briefs for all the units throughout the AA to kind of see how many of them are still recommending Robin Evans. It's quite a number. But one of the things that I did notice is that actually by proportion, his kind of notoriety, let's say, among the graduate school or the postgraduate programs is significantly higher. And I actually wonder, I was going to come to you, Emily, to ask about first year, really, and whether or not Robin Evans is something that you find on the reading list or that you recommend to students, because it is interesting that it seems to, at least within this institution, I don't know about elsewhere, that it's sort of settled into being something that skews towards more developed sort of minds, let's say, in architectural learning.
Yeah, I haven't told my students to read these yet, but I wonder now if it would be quite an interesting exercise to give it to them to see what they would make of it. I think it also kind of points back to what Ryan began with, but I think you can't write like this unless you are really looking. I appreciate it takes a long time also to kind of put these kinds of essays together, but kind of really looking at objects. And I have students, we go to museums and they will kind of take a photo of the object and then they will go and find a bench and then trace the object on their phone, which is a very funny thing to do, rather than drawing the object, because that feels quite, I don't know if it's intimidating or strange to do it that way, but I think it would be good to kind of get them to sort of read even the developed service drawing, to kind of, I don't know, encourage them to look at objects or actually go and visit things, and actually those experiences are just as valid as having a beautiful figurative drawing, which I think a lot of architecture students come into first year trying to make drawings look like photographs rather than making drawings that help them. And that's probably what you spend half a year doing, is to sort of say, and also you have students, even today, they were saying, oh, well, this person has 3 drawings and I have 1 drawing. Should I make 2 drawings? And so what would you make those 2 drawings of? And they're like, oh, I don't know, because I need to do my casts. And it's sort of understanding it as a tool, I think, is really important, but then also sort of looking at objects and then also writing about them. I think students I feel like writing is often quite daunting. And even this is an example of writing, I think, is quite an inspiring piece, because he's sort of doing it for himself. He's not doing it to impress, I don't think.
I think there's a lot to be learnt from the very long article on Peter Esmond. I think the students are bombarded with texts which are there to congratulate the writer on what they did or what their projects are, which Bob unbelievably politely spends, whatever it is, 40 pages sort of saying. So I think it's really important that kind of, I'm calling it forensic, which is probably the wrong term to say, but that kind of first-hand kind of archaeology of what a space might be or what history might be really is necessary, because the plain English I say with great conviction. I think, essays are written, texts are put forward which are incomprehensible. They're full of terms which are not there. So I think he's fighting in that essay for a certain clarity. I think the other side won. So I'm being provocative, but I think the other side won. I think, I keep on reading texts which are completely impenetrable. They don't really say very much. They justify their own work. A lot of architects writing, particularly, so we have to read that quite a lot. And there's a lack of generosity and a lack of communication. And I think it is really important that this is a sort of an example of how to look, how to interpret, and how to communicate, which I think is really critical.
I think also in the translations essay, I was looking at it yesterday, and he sort of talks about how artistic drawings or paintings they sort of represent objects that have an existence before they're in the painting, so they're in nature, and then architectural drawings don't exist before they're drawn. And I think that's a really nice way of that's probably what I would tell my students, because maybe some of them wouldn't read the essay, but I think that's a really nice way of understanding. I've never thought about architectural drawings that way until yesterday, so I think it's a good, clear way of distinguishing them.
That's a set of relationships that really gets worked through in the projective cast, where you have that, we showed the diagram, complete set of kind of projections, as it were, between imagination through to representation of the building and so on. There are threads that can be drawn in all directions.
I think, certainly from my side as well, it's something that I would recommend to students a lot of the time for all of these reasons, and particularly, I think, as you say, reading through all the different essays, they're each quite a self-contained, I mean, in this book particularly as a kind of compendium of different essays, they each target something quite specific and they elucidate a kind of argument towards it that really throughout, I think, represents, or at least collectively, a kind of approach. This is something I say to students a lot, probably somewhere in the room, you know who you are. It's like, don't take anything at face value, that a drawing is not just a drawing somehow, that you do a drawing with a degree of intelligence, of understanding that it's what it's connected to, the idea it seeks to portray, and also, therefore, the histories that it is inextricably connected to, and the social value also that drawing may eventually embody as a physical object in the world. And those sequences of translations, I think, are what this book does an incredibly sort of elegant job of elucidating. And they're all at different points in his career, but it really shapes a way of looking at architecture and what we do as a completely interconnected set of tools, objects, approaches, ideas, and kind of really theories as well, which are so fundamental and that he was instrumental in shaping within the context of British architectural education, particularly, and also North American, with all of his kind of involvement there. I think to make sure that we've got kind of enough time for a few questions, I'll sort of wrap it up there, and just really to say that also the book itself is kind of an interesting object, the new version particularly, in the sense that also, and this goes back to the conversation we were having about the contemporary relevance of his ideas, it is, and I will stand corrected if Andrew is in the room and tells me otherwise, but so far as I'm aware, and also from my experience and knowledge working in the print studio as well, it's the highest it is the highest selling AA text ever published. And it has been, this is now its fourth incarnation. It was originally compiled in 1997, which was also when Moyson, Robin's former colleague, was the director of the AA and wrote the introduction. It was then reprinted in 2003. It was then reprinted again in the blue version in 2011. And so now this is the fourth iteration of it. And I think there's even something interesting in the fact that it now has been completely reformatted. It is a new object that appeals in a way through different design sensibilities, also to a different generation perhaps of students and architects. And I think it's clear that the ideas within somehow remain the same, but they remain utterly relevant. Perhaps final word.
I was just going to say, I think that the new version of it is the best version of it. I think the paper and the layout really suits his writing, actually. The first version was a bit sort of stiff and a bit of a lump, but this one's a really nice design.
I was saying to, just on that, I was saying to Ryan, actually, that when I was rereading, some of the things, I've got the first one, the green one, the first one that came out, and I kept on going like that, thinking that there's another page, because all the pages are about this thick. So, compared to a normal book, I kept on thinking, am I moving 2 pages at once? It's really thick. It's completely very extravagant publication.
Yeah, but I think the book as a changing object for changing times and context, but maintaining the sort of relevance, the focus on ideas is also a perfect somehow symbol, perhaps also of Robin and his career and his teaching. On that note, I wonder if it's worth kind of opening up if there are any questions from the floor.
If anyone has any questions, just if you raise your hand, I can pass around the mic. Yeah.
Thank you so much for all of that. It was so interesting. I had a question about Foucault, which is something that you raised at the very beginning, and it's something that I've often thought about in relation to my dad's work, and also something that you said, Kostas, about how he didn't fit in within institutions. And it was just making me think a bit more about that. I don't know how much he sort of reflected on that himself, the fact that he had written this book about fabrication of virtue before Foucault. I mean, did he think about that? Or does anybody know, what his thoughts are about that, or whether he just wasn't something he was interested in?
I mean, my feeling is that, for instance, when it's in the book actually, but when we discuss Bentham or the Panopticon and so on, he would just discuss it. He wouldn't refer to the other sources that wrote about them. Of course, he was part of it. Actually, the essay where his unbelievably extensive knowledge about a particular topic is again the Eisenman one. There he quotes Saussure, he quotes all the other things which are happening around them. I think he didn't necessarily do that. I think the influences were there. But he didn't sort of say, right, this person was writing in that way, so therefore I'm doing it this way. I think he kept that to himself. I think he played a little bit of poker at that level. I think a lot of it was done by implication. I think Bob was very good at being quietly inspiring and coercive. If you see what I mean. I think he would make you go off and read something rather than necessarily tell you what his thoughts were on the source of what he was talking about. So, and I think that was a very special skill, not to make you feel that you might not have enough knowledge. I think he was absolutely wonderful person actually, so as a human being, and I think somehow he could get you into conversation that maybe was beyond you in a manner that didn't ever minimize you. I think other people, they give you so many references, so many quotes when they speak to you that you suddenly feel threatened by them. I think he was totally the opposite. I think if you'd wanted to discuss that with him, I mean, I never did actually. I never sat down to discuss Foucault and so on. I would have loved to just discuss the two styles of writing. I mean, Foucault is quite hard work. Bob is very easy to read. I think if you raised the conversation, he would have had it, but he wouldn't have referred to necessarily to the other things. Certainly, my experience with him, he was very kind of. He probably wanted you to work it out yourself. What the connection might be. I think that's...
Speaking of working it out for yourself, I mean, I all my knowledge about Robin only comes from sort of studying him to an extent, but it's so far as I'm aware, he also translated some early writings of Foucault and taught himself French in order to do it. But there's a kind of amazing autodidact.
I was going to say that's what I'd heard, but and I know he was familiar with that text, but I couldn't say to what extent he reflected on its relevant, and it wasn't the timing wasn't something that I was aware of until you pointed it out today. But an interesting question would be when it first appeared in English, and if you did kind of translate it, then that's particularly interesting.
I think historically it wasn't. Again, maybe I made this point too many times, but I don't think people necessarily referred to the sources. Okay, so in my later year after Bob, doing Dip 10, I did The Situationist, all sorts of things. He never mentioned Lefebvre once, so I discovered Lefebvre after I graduated. Now, there's no way that Situationism and all these things weren't related, but neither Bernard nor Nigel ever said Lefebvre. Somehow there was a tendency in that time to almost teach from first principles, and I think because the way that Bob looked at architecture was very much him going to measure. I think he encouraged you to do the same. He didn't sort of encourage you to go to the library and then look at architecture. He and that's something I've inherited from him. He sort of encouraged you to go and look at it first, and then maybe do your research afterwards. So I think that's how I would explain. I think the sources were there, and obviously the library was huge. I think the plastic bag with books was always full of books, but he didn't necessarily refer to them. He kind of he would do it in an indirect way, I think.
Do we have any more questions? I mean, one thing I'm struck with the conversation is the idea, Ben, you mentioned, sort of the essays are about design, and in one way we too often maybe think of when you're doing a writing project to sit down and you research and then you go through a series of drafts and then you have the final piece. But in one way, these essays often feel like you're reading the process itself, the process of writing, the process of researching, and you're, as has been said, you're going on that journey with him, and which I think opens up so many avenues to sort of interpret the text and what he's doing. But I think the idea of process through writing is quite important. Were there any other questions? Robin's work or any of the sort of interpretations from the panel?
Has anybody read the book?
If not, we can buy it. All right.
All right.
Maybe we'll
Wrap it up? Yeah, I think so, yeah. So I just want to thank Rory for chairing, and Carlos, and Richard, Emily, Ben, thank you for your time. And again, thank you, Bonnie, and Robin's family for the support for both the event and the publication. Thank you for everyone joining us tonight.
That was great.